You come back to camp carrying more than you can eat before nightfall, and that is when the real problem begins. Not the hunting, not the digging, not the finding. The problem starts when other eyes notice what you have, when smoke carries the smell, when children drift closer without being told, when a bad week for someone else becomes your good week made visible. You can hide a berry in your hand, maybe. You can hide a bead, a scrap, a private little object. It is much harder to hide meat, dried fish, honey, fat, roots, baskets, tools, all the heavy things that keep a group alive for one more cold stretch. And if you get this wrong, it is not just awkward. It changes who eats, who owes, who commands, who gets left behind, and what kind of people your people become. Did ancient tribes need the hoarder? Let's go through it properly. The common assumption is that ancient tribes survived because everybody shared, and the selfish hoarder would only have damaged the group. Except that's not actually how it worked. Because the first thing you have to do is separate two ideas that modern people tend to collapse into one. One is storage, which simply means holding resources across time. The other is hoarding, which usually means private accumulation beyond immediate need, often protected from others. Those are not the same thing. A buried cache of roots for winter is not automatically greed. A smokehouse full of salmon is not automatically selfishness. And a society that punishes private withholding can still depend on some forms of stored surplus. That distinction matters almost all the way down. Start with the kind of foraging society that anthropologists sometimes call immediate return. That phrase sounds technical, but it just means you eat the results of your labor relatively quickly. You gather, you hunt, you consume, and then you do it again. In those settings, large private stores are often hard to maintain for very practical reasons. People move. Camps shift. Resources spoil. Success is unpredictable. If one hunter gets lucky today, another may get lucky next week, and nobody can rely on being the winner every time. So the mechanism is not saintliness. It is risk. When life runs on uncertainty, sharing becomes a kind of insurance system made out of people instead of vaults. A person with a large animal cannot easily consume it alone before it turns. A person who refuses to share today may find others less eager to support them tomorrow. And because goods are visible, heavy, smelly, and socially legible, attempts at secrecy are limited by physics before they are limited by morality. Picture it in concrete terms. A large carcass comes in. There is blood on hands, flies in the heat, noise at the edge of the fire, children already watching which adult cuts what. Everyone knows that one successful hunt does not prove permanent superiority. It may only prove that one spear landed well once. In many documented forager societies, this is exactly where leveling pressure appears. Jokes, demands, expectations, ridicule of arrogance, all the little social tools humans use when they do not want one good day to turn into one permanent ruler. The implication is uncomfortable if you like simple stories. Many ancient communities did not need the hoarder, in the sense of needing a private accumulator who sat on surplus while others waited. They needed circulation more than they needed stockpiles under one person's control. In some ecologies, the anti-hoarder norm was not moral decoration. It was infrastructure. Now let's complicate that immediately, because otherwise this becomes one of those soothing myths people tell about a lost egalitarian Eden. Sharing did not mean everybody was equally generous all the time. Anthropologists who have studied living foragers have pointed out, again and again, that people sometimes try to get away with keeping small, concealable valuables, and that sharing norms often have to be enforced. In other words, the instinct to keep is not some modern corruption that appeared with supermarkets and retirement accounts. It is older than that. Much older. The point is that some societies were arranged to make keeping difficult, expensive, or reputationally dangerous. And that takes us to mobility, which almost nobody outside anthropology thinks about enough. A mobile society is hard to hoard in. Not impossible. Hard. If you move often, then every private store becomes weight. Every possession becomes a negotiation with your back, your basket, the next river crossing, the next dry stretch, the next camp. This is one reason researchers have argued that high mobility helps explain strong norms of demand sharing, the practice where a person in possession of valued resources can be expected, even pressured, to give some up. If people can walk away, if relationships are flexible, if camps rearrange, then monopolizing food becomes socially unstable. That sounds abstract, so let's shrink it down. Imagine trying to turn yourself into a local food lord in a group that can simply stop sleeping beside you. You begin to guard access, you become difficult, you insist that your labor deserves special privileges. Fine, but the others are not peasants attached to your field. They are mobile, they have kin elsewhere, they can relocate. They can mock you, they can refuse future cooperation. The social cost of your little empire rises fast. The implication here is subtle but important. What kept many early foraging groups relatively egalitarian was not merely kindness. It was the combination of mobility, perishability, visibility, and social exit. Hoarding fails when other people can leave, when goods do not keep, and when prestige depends on generosity more than possession. So if you are asking whether ancient tribes needed the hoarder as a stabilizing specialist, the answer in a lot of mobile forager settings looks like no. The hoarder would not stabilize the group, the hoarder would destabilize it. Now here's something that almost nobody talks about. There is real evidence that hunter-gatherers in warm climates often experienced less famine than agricultural populations. That sounds backwards to modern ears because agriculture feels like security. Fields, granaries, fences, rows, control. Civilization loves the look of stored calories. But farming can lock you into a narrow menu and a single seasonal gamble. If the crop fails, it fails at scale. If a foraging economy is diverse, mobile, and socially connected, it can sometimes spread risk better than a field can. And that shifts the whole emotional frame. We tend to imagine the non-hoarding group as naive and the storing society as rational. But diversified foraging, broad social networks, and reciprocal exchange can function as a different kind of rationality. Not no buffer. A human buffer. Not a room full of grain. A web full of obligations. There is even modeling work suggesting that food-sharing networks can reduce starvation risk through social structure itself. With resources moving through clusters of relationships rather than sitting in one place under one owner. In plain English, a group can store resilience in its network. That is a strange sentence by modern standards, but it may be the right one. Your backup supply might not be a cellar. It might be people. Think about what that means at the sensory level. No giant pantry. No lock. No inventory sheet. Instead, you remember who married where, whose sister lives 2 camps over, who shared last dry season. Who can be trusted with dried meat, who has access to shellfish when inland game fails. Who owes, who is ashamed, who is proud, who would rather go hungry than be called stingy. This is storage translated into relationship. The implication is not that private stores are useless. It is that private stores are only one way to fight scarcity. And not always the best way. Some ancient groups likely survived not by tolerating a hoarder, but by distributing the anti-famine function across the social body. Now let's talk about the places where that changes, because it absolutely does change. Not all hunter-gatherers were highly mobile, small-band, immediate-return societies. Some lived in rich environments with seasonal abundance, especially where fish runs, marine resources, nuts, or other predictable foods could be harvested in bulk and preserved. Anthropologists often describe these as delayed return systems. Again, that just means labor is invested and the payoff comes later. Once you can preserve food at scale, guard it, inherit it, and organize labor around it, you have moved into very different territory. This is where the simple anti-hoarder story starts to crack. Take the classic example of the northwest coast of North America, where some indigenous societies historically relied on massive seasonal surpluses, especially salmon, alongside storage, property rights, rank, and highly developed ceremonial redistribution. These were foragers, yes, but not the stripped-down caricature people imagine when they hear the word tribe. They could be relatively settled. They could accumulate. They could differentiate status. They could build systems in which controlling stored abundance mattered enormously. And now the mechanism flips. Once food can be preserved and defended, the person or household that controls storage can also influence labor, alliances, marriage, prestige, and obligation. Property matters more because investment stretches across time. Leadership positions become more durable because surplus can support followers, guests, rituals, and dependents. Inheritance matters because the store outlives the storer. You do not just have dinner. You have leverage. Picture the scene. Racks of fish drying. Smoke thick in the air. The smell clinging to clothing, skin, cedar walls. Enough abundance in a good season to carry bodies through a bad one, but only if somebody organizes the work, protects the stores, times the use, and turns that material pile into a social system. At that point, the group may not need the hoarder, as a miser exactly, but it may very well need custodians of surplus, managers of delayed return, households with greater storage capacity, people whose power is partly made of accumulated food. And here comes the complication, because human beings never permit a clean theory for long. In some of those same societies, the surplus holder was not simply a selfish taker. Stored wealth could be used for feasting, redistribution, gift-giving, ceremonial display, and social insurance. Accumulation and generosity could become intertwined. You stored in order to give spectacularly. You controlled more in order to distribute more. That does not erase inequality. If anything, it can help build it. But it means the line between hoarder and provider becomes blurry enough to be politically dangerous. So did those societies need the hoarder? Maybe not the hoarder as we imagine him, hunched over a secret pile, but perhaps something like a surplus organizer, a node of storage, a household capable of holding time in material form. And that is a very different answer from the one that fits a mobile desert forager band. Now let's talk about psychology, because if you leave human minds out of this, the argument gets too mechanical. There is a reason hoarding feels intuitively ancient to us. Across the animal world, storing food evolves where environments are seasonal, uncertain, or sharply variable. Birds cache seeds. Mammals bury food. The logic is simple enough. Abundance comes in pulses, scarcity comes later, memory and hiding bridge the gap. Some historians and psychologists have argued that humans, especially in deep prehistory, likely had cognitive tendencies that made caching and saving deeply comprehensible, maybe even natural under the right conditions. But this is exactly where you have to slow down and refuse the easy leap. A squirrel caching nuts is not a blueprint for a human political economy. Human beings do not just store calories. We store status, obligation, reputation, kinship, taboo, shame. A cache in a human group sits inside a moral system. It can trigger envy. It can create followers. It can provoke theft. It can invite demands. It can become sacred, inherited, taxed, shared, seized, redistributed, or mocked. We are not only animals that store. We are animals that argue about what stored things mean. So yes, there may be a deep human capacity to feel safer when resources are set aside, hidden, saved for later. That does not prove that ancient tribes needed hoarders. It only suggests that the temptation, and sometimes the utility, of accumulation was available to be shaped by culture. Culture is the important word there. The same nervous system that says keep some for later can live in one society where that impulse becomes prudent foresight, and in another where it becomes antisocial behavior. Now let's talk about one more mechanism, because it helps explain why the answer changes so much across societies. As soon as storage becomes more private, durable, and transferable, inequality has room to breathe. Anthropologists have long argued that large-scale storage among foragers correlates, in some cases, with stronger property rights and more pronounced social hierarchy. Not everywhere, not automatically, but often enough that it matters. And later research on small-scale societies interacting with markets suggests something similar. When people gain new ways to save, store, and accumulate individually, traditional sharing obligations can weaken and inequality can rise. That does not mean sharing disappears overnight. Humans are stubbornly social. Reciprocity hangs on. Kin still matter. Neighbors still remember. But the balance shifts. If risk can be buffered through private savings instead of mutual aid, then the wealthy need the network less. And if they need it less, they may invest less in keeping it alive. Again, shrink that to the human scale. In one world, your hungry week is everybody's business because next month it could be theirs. In another, someone with enough stores can endure alone for longer. And the temptation to disengage from communal obligation grows. The store does not merely feed the body. It changes the moral math. The implication is blunt. Ancient groups did not just face a choice between hoarding and sharing. They faced a deeper institutional question: where should security live? In a private stockpile, in a household, in a chief's house, in a kin network. In ritual redistribution, in mobility, in diversity of food sources. In the ability to leave, in the shame attached to selfishness. Every society answered that differently, and the answer shaped its hierarchy. Now, and this is essential, so I'm going to slow all the way down here, there are several ways to get this wrong. The first is romanticizing foragers as naturally pure communists who floated through prehistory without conflict, envy, or withholding. The evidence does not support that. Sharing norms are often strong precisely because the temptations against sharing are real. People bargain, resist, hide small things, resent freeloaders, monitor fairness, and care intensely about who is carrying weight and who is not. The second mistake is romanticizing the accumulator as some tragic genius the tribe foolishly misunderstood. That is modern individualist fantasy projected backward. In many contexts, a private hoarder is not a visionary. He is a threat to the group's anti-risk system. He converts shared uncertainty into unequal power. The third mistake is assuming that living hunter-gatherers are unchanged fossils of the Paleolithic. They are not. Anthropologists are very clear about this. Recent foraging peoples have histories, neighbors, innovations, losses, adaptations. You cannot simply point to one modern group and declare, that is exactly how humans lived 40,000 years ago. We do not know with confidence at that resolution. And the fourth mistake is treating tribe as if it names one social design. It does not. It is a broad, messy word that covers societies with radically different ecologies, settlement patterns, technologies, kinship systems, and political arrangements. Some ancient communities probably suppressed private accumulation very strongly. Some probably relied on modest caching without much hierarchy. Some likely built serious storage systems that supported rank, ownership, and power. The evidence does not cleanly support either a universal yes or a universal no. So let's return to the central question. Did ancient tribes need the hoarder? The honest answer the evidence allows is this. Many ancient foraging societies did not need a private hoarder, and in fact were structured to prevent one. Because mobility, perishability, and sharing networks buffered risk better than concentrated stores under one person's control. But some societies absolutely did need stored surplus, and once storage became durable, defendable, and socially organized. They also needed people or households who controlled, managed, or embodied that surplus across time. Not the hoarder maybes. The keeper. The organizer. The gatekeeper. And sometimes, yes, the early winner of a new inequality game. That sounds like a technical distinction, but it changes the moral picture. Because the real evolutionary and historical question may not be whether humans needed hoarders. It may be whether humans could afford to let security become private. In some ecologies, no. In others, yes, and the consequences were enormous. And if you step back from the archaeology and the anthropology and just look at the shape of the problem, it becomes strangely familiar. You live in a world that still has to decide where security lives. In your savings account, your pantry, your neighborhood, your family. The state and insurance contract, a friend who answers at 2 a.m. A warehouse, a supply chain, a data center, a freezer humming in the dark. The ancient argument never ended. It only changed costumes. That may be why this question carries more emotional weight than it seems to at first. Because when you ask whether a tribe needed the hoarder, you are also asking what kind of creature a human being really is under scarcity. A solitary accumulator, a reciprocal partner, a strategist, a moralist, a frightened mammal with excellent memory. Probably all of them, depending on the season. And maybe that is the quietest, hardest thing the evidence suggests. Human beings are not built for one permanent answer. We can survive by sharing risk through relationships, and we can survive by storing value through objects. We can punish accumulation, and we can build civilizations around it. We can turn generosity into prestige and prestige back into inequality. We can do all of that without ever quite resolving whether safety should be held in common or held behind a wall. So if you were standing there at the edge of an ancient camp, holding more food than you could eat before it spoiled, the real question would not just be what you wanted to do with it. The real question would be what kind of world your people had already made around your hands. And that world then is now decides whether the hoarder looks like a fool, a criminal, a provider, or the beginning of a hierarchy. It was never just about keeping food. It was about where tomorrow was allowed to live.